Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
When my parents landed in Europe expecting luxury, they found something entirely different waiting for them. Something I had planned all along. Let me tell you how it came to this. A few months ago, I decided it was time to give my parents something they'd never forget, a luxurious one-week trip to Europe. They talked about visiting Europe for as long as I could remember, but life always got in the way. Between raising two kids, paying bills, and saving for the future, their dream always got pushed to the back burner. Now that I was in a good place financially, I wanted to make it happen. It wasn't just about the trip. It was about showing them how much I appreciated everything they had done for me. When I told them about the surprise, my mom teared up immediately. "Are you serious?" she asked, her voice shaking. My dad, who was never one to show much emotion, just nodded slowly, a rare smile spreading across his face. "You've outdone yourself, kid," he said, giving me one of his firm pats on the back. Their reaction made every penny I spent on the trip worth it. I planned to join them on the trip, not just to ensure everything went smoothly, but also because I wanted to experience it with them. It felt like the perfect way to bond as a family and create memories we'd cherish forever. Over the next few weeks, I poured my heart into planning every detail. I booked business-class flights, five-star hotels, and private tours in every city. From gondola rides in Venice to a romantic dinner cruise in Paris, no expense was spared. It was their dream, and I wanted it to be flawless. The morning of the flight, I woke up earlier than usual, buzzing with excitement. My bags were packed, the travel documents were double-checked, and I couldn't wait to see the look on their faces when they finally experienced all the things I had lined up for them. I pulled up to their house to pick them up, ready to whisk them off to the airport. But when they came out of the house, something was off. My parents were standing on the porch with my younger sister, Emily. She was casually dressed, a suitcase by her side, while my parents stood awkwardly beside her. They weren't carrying luggage for three. My mom's usual warm smile was strained, and my dad was avoiding eye contact altogether. I rolled down the window, confused. "Where's your luggage?" I asked, looking at the empty space in the back of the car I'd cleared for them. My mom walked up to the car, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. "Honey, we need to talk," she said, her voice dripping with that overly sweet tone she always used when she was about to say something I wouldn't like. I stepped out of the car, glancing between them. "What's going on?" She hesitated, glancing at Emily, who was staring at her phone, looking completely uninterested. Finally, she blurted it out. "We've decided to take Emily instead of you." At first, I thought I'd misheard. "Wait, what?" I asked, laughing nervously. "You're joking, right?" But she wasn't. She started explaining how Emily had been under so much stress lately and how this trip would be good for her. "She needs a break, sweetheart. You've been doing so well at work, and you're so strong. We knew you'd understand," she said, her tone almost pleading. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Emily, my younger sister, hadn't held a steady job in years. She was constantly borrowing money from our parents, and her idea of stress was deciding which Netflix show to binge. And now, they were giving her my spot on the trip I had planned and paid for? Emily didn't even bother to look up from her phone. She just stood there looking smug like this was all perfectly normal. My dad finally spoke up, his voice low and awkward. "It's just she needed this more than you do. You've already got so much going on, and we thought it'd be nice for her to have this experience." I felt my stomach drop. "So you're saying I'm not going?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. My mom reached out to touch my arm, but I stepped back. "It's not like that, honey. It's just, well, you've been so generous, and we thought you'd understand." The anger was building in my chest, but I swallowed it down. I didn't trust myself to speak without shouting. Instead, I just nodded and watched as they loaded Emily's suitcase into the trunk. The drive to the airport was silent. My mom tried to make small talk a few times, but I couldn't bring myself to respond. Emily sat in the back seat, humming along to music on her headphones, completely oblivious. Or maybe she just didn't care. When we arrived, my mom gave me a quick hug and said, "Thank you for understanding, sweetheart. We'll bring you something nice from Europe." I didn't say anything. I just watched them walk away, Emily strutting ahead as if she were the one who had made all of this possible. As I drove back home, the anger and betrayal I felt simmered into something sharper. They might have blindsided me, but I wasn't done yet. They had no idea what was coming. As I stood on their front lawn, trying to process the words coming out of my mom's mouth, it felt like I had been hit with a bucket of ice water. "She's been really stressed lately," she repeated, as if I hadn't heard her the first time. Her smile, so casual and almost condescending, felt like a slap in the face. My mom said it so matter-of-factly, like it was the most logical thing in the world to take my sister, my lazy, jobless sister, on a trip that I had planned and paid for. Emily had spent the better part of the last few years living off my parents, sleeping till noon, and whining about how unfair life was. She'd never once lifted a finger to help them out or even taken responsibility for her own problems. And now, apparently, she needed a vacation to recover from all the stress of doing absolutely nothing. I glanced over at Emily. She was lounging against the doorframe, scrolling through her phone like she didn't have a care in the world. Her suitcase sat next to her, obnoxiously pink and covered in stickers of places she'd probably never even been. She finally looked up, catching my gaze, and gave me the smuggest little grin I'd ever seen. I couldn't believe this was happening. So, I'm not going, I finally managed to say, though the words felt thick in my throat. My mom tilted her head as if she were trying to soothe me. "It's not like that, honey," she said, stepping closer and placing a hand on my arm. "We just thought Emily needed this more than you did. You've been doing so well at work, and you're always so strong and capable. We knew you'd understand." Understand? I wanted to scream. I wanted to point out that the only reason this trip was even happening was because of me, because I had spent weeks planning and paying for everything to give them something special. But I didn't say any of that. I didn't trust myself to speak without my voice cracking or my anger spilling over. Instead, I just stared at her, my expression blank. My dad, ever the silent participant, shuffled awkwardly beside the car. He didn't even try to meet my eyes. When he finally spoke, his tone was quiet and unsure. "It's just for this trip. We'll do something together next time," he mumbled. Next time? That was rich. Like there was going to be a next time after this betrayal. I turned back to Emily, who was now pulling her suitcase toward the car with a dramatic huff, as though she were the one being inconvenienced. She climbed into the back seat without so much as a thank you, popping her headphones in and immediately tuning us all out. The car ride to the airport was suffocating. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles turning white as I focused on the road. My mom sat in the passenger seat, trying to fill the silence with forced small talk. She chatted about the weather, the flight time, and how she'd heard good things about the hotel in Paris. "It's going to be so lovely," she said, her voice overly cheerful. "I can't wait for Emily to see the Eiffel Tower. She's always dreamed of it, you know?" I didn't respond. I couldn't. The words were lodged somewhere between my chest and my throat, a knot of anger and betrayal I didn't dare let loose. If I opened my mouth, I wasn't sure what would come out. In the back seat, Emily was humming along to whatever was playing in her headphones, completely oblivious to the tension in the car. Or maybe she wasn't oblivious. Maybe she just didn't care. My dad stayed silent the entire ride. He sat stiffly, staring out the window, as if he could physically distance himself from the situation. I kept catching glimpses of him in the rearview mirror, but he never once looked up to meet my eyes. When we finally pulled into the airport drop-off lane, I threw the car in a park with more force than necessary. My mom turned to me with that same tight smile, like she genuinely believed I was okay with all of this. "Thank you so much for driving us, sweetheart," she said, leaning in to kiss my cheek. "You're such a good daughter. We'll bring you something nice from Europe." I just nodded, keeping my face blank. Emily climbed out of the car, dragging her suitcase behind her. She didn't even bother to say goodbye, already snapping a selfie with the airport in the background. #airport life, she muttered to herself, her thumbs flying over her phone screen. My dad lingered for a moment, still not meeting my eyes. "We'll see you when we get back," he said gruffly, before following my mom and Emily toward the terminal. I stayed in the car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my hands ached. I watched as they disappeared into the crowd, my anger simmering into something colder, something sharper. By the time I pulled out of the airport, my thoughts had shifted from disbelief to determination. I couldn't stop replaying the conversation in my head, the smug way Emily had grinned, the way my mom had brushed off my feelings like they didn't matter. They thought they could just take what I'd given them and hand it to someone else without consequences. They thought I'd just roll over and accept it. But they were wrong. They had no idea what I was capable of. After dropping them off at the airport, I drove home in a haze of fury and disbelief. The betrayal clung to me like a second skin, suffocating and inescapable. By the time I stepped into my apartment, I was practically vibrating with pent-up anger. I tossed my keys on the counter, sat at my desk, and opened my laptop, unsure of what I was even looking for. It wasn't just anger, it was something else, something sharper, more focused. My hands hovered over the keyboard as the thought crept in. All the reservations are in my name. The itinerary I'd spent weeks painstakingly planning, the luxury accommodations, the private tours. Everything was under my control. My parents might have decided to swap me out for Emily, but they hadn't thought through the logistics. And that gave me an opening. For a moment, I hesitated. A small, nagging voice in the back of my mind told me to let it go, to be the bigger person. But the memory of Emily's smug smile and my mom's dismissive tone was enough to drown that voice out. Why should I just roll over and let them get away with this? I pulled up the email confirmation from the travel agency, staring at the detailed itinerary I had put together. There it was, laid out in perfect precision. Business class flights, luxury hotel rooms with stunning views, exclusive dinners, and private tours. It was a masterpiece, and I had crafted it with love and care. Now, looking at it, all I felt was bitterness. Canceling everything crossed my mind. A quick call, a few emails, and the entire trip would come crashing down. But as satisfying as that sounded, it wasn't enough. Canceling would make it too easy for them to paint me as the villain, to claim I had ruined the trip out of spite. No, I needed to be smarter. That's when the idea hit me. Simple, elegant, and absolutely perfect. I called the travel agency. The agent who picked up was cheerful and polite, clearly used to dealing with wealthy clients and their last-minute whims. I explained the situation carefully, omitting the more dramatic parts. I framed it as a necessary change. Unforeseen circumstances, a new approach to the itinerary. I'd like to make some adjustments, I said, my tone calm but firm. The agent paused, clearly confused. Adjustments, ma'am? Could you elaborate? Of course, I replied smoothly. The original plans no longer suit the travelers. They'll be taking a more budget-conscious approach to the trip. There was a beat of silence. I see, the agent said, clearly trying to process the shift from opulence to frugality. May I ask what specific changes you'd like to make? I smiled to myself as I outlined the new plan. The business class flights? Downgraded to economy. The luxury hotels? Replaced with budget accommodations, the kind where the showers are just a trickle and the air conditioning barely works. The private tours? Canceled entirely, swapped for group tours where they'd be crammed into buses with 50 other tourists, most of whom wouldn't even speak English. The agent sounded hesitant. Are you sure about this? It's quite a significant change. Oh, I'm sure, I said, my voice steady. Trust me, it's exactly what they need. The agent continued taking notes, her voice growing more tentative with every request. And the dinner reservations? She asked. Cancel them, I said. Instead, they'll be dining at local spots, cheap ones, preferably. Or better yet, leave it open. Let them figure it out. She cleared her throat. This is highly unusual. Are you certain the travelers will approve of these changes? I nearly laughed. They won't know the difference until they arrive, I said, carefully avoiding any trace of malice in my tone. Besides, they've already indicated that they want a more modest experience. I'm simply accommodating their wishes. The agent finally relented, albeit reluctantly. Very well, she said. I'll make the necessary changes and send you the updated itinerary. When I hung up, I felt an odd sense of satisfaction, like I just leveled the playing field. My parents and Emily had thought they could take advantage of my generosity without consequences, but they were about to learn otherwise. It wasn't just about revenge, it was about teaching them a lesson. They had taken my kindness for granted, dismissing me as if I were an afterthought. Now, they'd get to experience the trip they wanted, just not in the way they imagined. I sat back, staring at my laptop screen, where the original itinerary still gleamed in all its luxurious detail. For a brief moment, I felt a pang of regret. This wasn't how I'd envisioned things when I first planned the trip. I'd wanted it to be a gift, a chance to create beautiful memories together. But they had made their choice. And now, so had I. Over the next few days, I received updates from the travel agency. They had made all the changes I requested, albeit with some skepticism. The new itinerary looked nothing like the original. Gone were the luxury and comfort, replaced by mediocrity and inconvenience. When I received the final confirmation email, I couldn't help but smile. My parents and Emily had no idea what was waiting for them. They thought they were about to embark on the trip of a lifetime, but they were in for a rude awakening. All I had to do now was wait. The night they boarded the flight, I felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and nervousness. Knowing what awaited them gave me a sense of power, but there was still that lingering question. Would they figure it out? Would they confront me? I imagined their smug excitement as they settled into their economy seats, completely unaware of the downgraded experience ahead. Emily, no doubt, had her headphones on, probably bragging on social media about the luxury trip she was embarking on. My parents, meanwhile, were likely oblivious to how drastically their plans had changed. I almost wished I could have seen their faces when they realized they weren't flying business class. The luxurious seats that reclined into beds, the gourmet meals, and the champagne they were expecting had been replaced by cramped rows, subpar food, and the faint aroma of reheated coffee. But that was just the beginning. The next morning, I got my first update from the travel agency. The email came through just as I was pouring my coffee, and I couldn't help but smirk as I read the report. They had landed safely in Europe, and their assigned taxi driver had picked them up at the airport. Originally, I'd booked them a sleek, black Mercedes with a driver in a suit, someone who would greet them with a sign and a warm smile. Instead, they were greeted by a weathered taxi driver who barely spoke English, driving a beat-up sedan with a dented door. Apparently, my mom had hesitated at first, questioning whether this was the correct car. But the driver had insisted, showing her the updated reservation details. Reluctantly, they piled into the taxi, Emily already grumbling about the lack of bottled water and complimentary mints. The ride to the hotel was uneventful, though my dad had reportedly asked the driver several times if he was sure they were heading to the right place. When they arrived at the hotel, things took a turn for the worse, or better depending on how you looked at it. The original reservation had been for a spacious luxury suite with a balcony overlooking the city. It was supposed to include a private spa room, complimentary champagne, and round-the-clock concierge service. Instead, they were given a cramped economy room on the fourth floor with a single tiny window that faced a brick wall. The photos in the email update were enough to make me laugh out loud. The room was a far cry from luxury. The beds were twin-sized, the decor was outdated, and the bathroom was so small that the shower head was practically above the toilet. Emily, unsurprisingly, was the first to complain. "This is ridiculous," she had reportedly shouted at the receptionist. "This isn't what we booked." The receptionist, clearly accustomed to dealing with irate guests, simply shrugged and showed her the updated reservation details. My mom tried to defuse the situation, insisting there must have been a mistake. She pulled out her phone and called me, her voice already tinged with frustration. "Sweetheart," my mom said when I answered, "we just got to the hotel and, well, there's been some kind of mix-up. This isn't the suite you booked. It's tiny and there's no spa or anything. Can you call the agency and fix this?" I took a deep breath, making sure to sound calm and concerned. "Oh no, that's awful," I said, feigning surprise. "Let me check on it and get back to you." "Thank you," she said, her tone softening slightly. "We're just so confused. This isn't like you at all." "I'll handle it," I assured her before hanging up. Of course, I had no intention of calling the agency. Instead, I spent the rest of the day imagining their growing frustration as they tried to make sense of their new accommodations. Later that evening, I got another update from the travel agency. My parents had attempted to order room service, only to find that the hotel didn't offer it. Emily had apparently thrown a fit when she realized they'd have to venture out to find dinner. The fine dining experience they were expecting, replaced by a quick meal at a nearby fast food joint. When I checked my phone later, I saw a message from my mom. It was short and to the point. "Please call me when you can." I didn't respond. The next day brought even more entertainment. They had signed up for a city tour, expecting the private guide I'd originally arranged. Instead, they found themselves on a crowded bus with dozens of other tourists, many of whom spoke languages my parents didn't understand. According to the travel agency, Emily had spent the entire tour complaining about how boring it was, while my dad tried in vain to ask the guide questions over the noise of the crowd. My mom had apparently attempted to keep the peace, but even she was visibly frustrated by the end of the day. That evening, she called me again. This time, her voice was strained, teetering between confusion and irritation. "Honey, we've had another issue," she said. "The tour wasn't what we expected at all. It wasn't private, and the bus was so crowded. Are you sure these are the right arrangements?" I paused, pretending to think. "That's so strange," I said finally. "Let me check with the agency. It sounds like there might have been a miscommunication." "Thank you," she said, though her tone made it clear she was running out of patience. For the next few days, I kept tabs on their progress through updates and occasional phone calls from my mom. Each day seemed to bring a new disappointment. A canceled dinner reservation, a subpar breakfast buffet, another cramped group tour. By the end of the week, even my dad, who rarely voiced his frustrations, had called me to ask if something was wrong. "This isn't like you," he said quietly. "I know you wouldn't have planned something like this." "I'm looking into it," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "I'll get back to you soon." But I never did. When I finally checked my email one last time that week, I found the final update from the travel agency. Their trip was coming to an end, and they'd made no further complaints to the staff, likely because they'd given up trying. I couldn't help but smile as I closed my laptop. They wanted to take Emily on my trip, and they had gotten exactly what they asked for, just not in the way they'd imagined. Now all that was left was to see how they'd react when they came home. The morning after their rocky arrival, my parents and Emily were scheduled for a city tour, the same one they'd been so excited about when I initially presented the trip. Back then, I described it in vivid detail. A private guide fluent in English, a luxury car to whisk them from landmark to landmark, and a flexible itinerary tailored to their preferences. It was supposed to be intimate and leisurely, the perfect way to experience the city without the usual tourist crowds. But the updated version was far from that. I'd replaced the private tour with a budget group excursion. Instead of a sleek car, they were crammed into a massive bus alongside at least 50 other travelers. The air conditioning barely worked, the windows were smudged, and the guide's heavily accented English was difficult to understand. The bus made frequent stops at kitschy souvenir shops, the kind where everything is overpriced and gaudy, and they spent more time waiting for other passengers to return than actually seeing the sights. I received an email from the travel agency with an update about their day. The agent's tone was professional, but I could sense the underlying amusement as she described their reactions. My mom, ever the optimist, tried to make the best of it, but even she couldn't hide her disappointment. She'd spent most of the tour with a strained smile plastered across her face, nodding politely as the guide rambled on about something she clearly didn't understand. Emily, on the other hand, was a complete disaster. According to the report, she spent the entire day whining about everything. The bus was too crowded, the guide was boring, the other tourists were annoying, and the landmarks weren't as impressive as she'd imagined. At one point, she even refused to get off the bus at one of the stops, claiming she was too tired to deal with this nonsense. My dad, usually stoic and reserved, sat in stony silence for most of the tour. But the frustration was evident in his posture, the way his arms were crossed tightly over his chest, and how he avoided making eye contact with anyone. Lunch was the tipping point. Originally, I'd arranged for them to dine at an upscale restaurant with panoramic views of the city. It was supposed to be a 3-course meal with wine pairings, the kind of experience that would leave them raving for weeks. But that reservation had long since been canceled. Instead, they were handed boxed lunches as they boarded the bus after the morning portion of the tour. The meals consisted of cold sandwiches, a bag of chips, and a bottle of water. There wasn't even a proper place to sit and eat. The guide cheerfully informed them they could enjoy their lunch on the go as the bus headed to the next stop. Emily reportedly lost it. "What is this garbage?" she'd shouted, holding up the sandwich as if it were toxic waste. She refused to eat it, sulking in her seat while everyone else quietly munched on their lunches. My mom tried to pacify her, offering to share her own meal, but Emily wasn't having it. "This isn't what we signed up for," she snapped loud enough for the entire bus to hear. My dad, clearly embarrassed, muttered something under his breath and turned to stare out the window, avoiding the scene entirely. That evening, I received a call from my dad. It was the first time he'd reached out directly since the trip began, and his tone was noticeably strained. "Hey," he said, his voice clipped. "Are you sure these are the right arrangements? This isn't like you." I leaned back in my chair, a small smile playing on my lips. "What do you mean?" I asked, feigning ignorance. "This tour," he said. "It wasn't private. The bus was packed, the guide barely spoke English, and lunch was, well, it wasn't great. It's just not what we expected." I could hear the frustration in his voice, and for a moment I almost felt bad. "Almost. That's what I booked," I replied evenly. "It's a more authentic experience. You should enjoy it." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Finally, he sighed. "All right. Thanks, I guess." And then he hung up. The next day, I got another update from the travel agency. They'd spent the morning visiting a popular historical site. It was one of those attractions that looks stunning in photos but is packed with tourists in real life. The lines were long, the crowds were noisy, and my parents and Emily didn't even get close to the main exhibit. Emily, predictably, had another meltdown. She complained loudly about how unfair it was that they had to wait in line and how the whole experience was a waste of time. My mom tried to calm her down, but Emily was inconsolable. By the time they returned to their hotel that evening, the mood was tense. My dad had stopped speaking altogether. My mom was visibly frazzled, and Emily was sulking in her room. That night, I received another call, this time from my mom. "Sweetheart," she began, her voice hesitant. "We're having some issues with the itinerary. Are you sure everything is in order? This doesn't feel right." I could tell she was trying to be diplomatic, but there was an edge to her tone, a mix of confusion and irritation. Everything is exactly as it should be, I said calmly. I'm not sure why you're having trouble, but this is what I planned. But the lunch today... I'm sorry, Mom, I interrupted, keeping my voice firm. I've done everything I can on my end. Maybe you just need to adjust your expectations. She was silent for a moment. All right, she said finally, though she didn't sound convinced. Thanks for checking. After I hung up, I sat back and stared at my phone, waiting for the guilt to creep in. But it didn't. They'd chosen to take Emily instead of me. They'd made their priorities clear. All I'd done was adjust the trip to reflect their decision. If they didn't like it, well, that was their problem. By the third day of their European adventure, cracks in the facade of my parents' and Emily's trip had widened into full-blown chasms. I received updates from the travel agency and kept a close watch on my phone, half expecting a barrage of angry calls and messages. Instead, the silence from their end was almost deafening, punctuated by occasional, strained messages from my mom. It wasn't until late in the afternoon that I finally got the call I had been waiting for. The number on my screen blinked accusingly, Mom. I let it ring a few times before answering, taking a deep breath to ensure my voice sounded calm and neutral. Hi, Mom, I said, my tone casual. Her voice on the other end was frazzled, her usual calm composure completely gone. Honey, we need to talk about this trip, she began, trying to keep her tone even, but failing miserably. What's going on? I asked, though I already had a pretty good idea. It's Emily, she sighed. She's upset. This isn't what we thought it would be. The tours, the hotels, the food, it's all so basic. She's been complaining nonstop, and I can't blame her. This isn't like you at all. Are you sure there hasn't been some mistake? The exasperation in her voice was almost enough to make me crack a smile. I pictured Emily sulking in their cramped hotel room, probably scrolling through Instagram and comparing her lackluster trip to the glamorous vacations her friends always posted. She wasn't used to being uncomfortable, and it was clear the reality of the trip had finally broken through her entitled exterior. Mom, I'm sorry to hear that you're having issues, I said, keeping my tone as sympathetic as possible. But I need you to be specific. What exactly is the problem? Her voice grew more desperate. The hotel is tiny, and there's no view. We can barely move around in the room. And the tours... Oh, honey, they're so crowded and impersonal. We're spending more time standing in lines than actually enjoying anything. And don't even get me started on the meals. Emily refused to eat yesterday because it was so disappointing. This isn't the trip you showed us. I paused, letting her words hang in the air for a moment before responding. Mom, let me ask you something, I said calmly. Did you and Dad decide to bring Emily on this trip instead of me because you felt she needed it more? The question seemed to catch her off guard. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line before she finally answered. Well, yes, she admitted hesitantly. She's been so stressed, and we thought this would help her relax. Right, I said, my voice steady. And when you made that decision, did you consider how it might affect the plans I had already made? She didn't respond. I decided it was time to lay my cards on the table. Well, most of them, the original plans for the trip were based on the idea that we'd all be going together, I began. When you decided to bring Emily instead, I had to make some adjustments. I assumed you wanted something simpler, something that would be more accessible for her. I mean, you did prioritize her needs, right? The silence on the other end of the call was priceless. I could almost hear the gears turning in her head as she tried to process what I was saying. So, you changed the plans? She finally asked, her voice a mixture of disbelief and confusion. Yes, I said simply. The private tours, the luxury hotels, the fine dining, it was all designed for the original guest list. When that changed, I made adjustments to reflect the new priorities. I thought that's what you wanted. She was quiet for a long moment before she spoke again, her tone low and uncertain. But Emily's miserable. She says this trip is nothing like what you described. She was expecting. Mom, I interrupted gently. Emily was expecting a trip she didn't plan, didn't pay for, and didn't earn. You decided to give her my spot, so I did my best to accommodate that decision. If she's unhappy, maybe you should talk to her about gratitude. The weight of my words seemed to hit her, and for the first time, she sounded genuinely remorseful. Honey, we didn't mean to hurt you, she said softly. We thought it would be easier for you to understand. You've always been so independent, so strong. That's not the point, I said firmly. This wasn't just about a trip. It was about showing appreciation, about creating something special for all of us. You took that away, and now you're upset because it didn't work out the way you thought it would. Maybe you should think about why that is. She didn't respond, and I could tell she was struggling to find the right words. Finally, she sighed. I'm sorry, she said quietly. I really am. I don't know what else to say. When the call ended, I felt a strange mixture of emotions. On one hand, it was satisfying to finally say what I had been holding in since they blindsided me at the airport. On the other hand, it was clear that my mom was genuinely upset, and part of me wondered if I'd gone too far. But then I remembered Emily's smug grin as she climbed into the car, my dad's silence, and my mom's dismissive tone when she said, "We thought you'd understand." They had made their choice, and now they were dealing with the consequences. I leaned back in my chair, letting out a deep breath. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, I felt a sense of closure. They still had a few more days left on their trip, and I had no doubt that the reality of their choices would continue to sink in. As for me, I was finally at peace. As the week dragged on, the calls and messages from my parents became less frequent until they stopped altogether. At first, I wasn't sure if they were giving me the silent treatment or if they'd simply given up on trying to get me to fix the situation. Either way, their absence on my phone felt strangely liberating. Instead, I relied on the updates from the travel agency to keep tabs on their progress, or lack thereof. The agency's notes, usually dry and professional, started taking on an almost amused tone. The staff were clearly entertained by my family's endless stream of complaints and mishaps. By midweek, the reality of their downgraded trip had fully sunk in. The luxury accommodations were nothing more than glorified budget hotels, with creaky beds, thin walls, and temperamental plumbing. The daily group tours continued to be overcrowded and chaotic, and the meals remained an ongoing point of contention. One update described a particularly disastrous dinner experience. They had ventured to a local cafe that looked charming from the outside, but turned out to have an hour-long wait, subpar food, and a waitress who seemed determined to ignore them. Emily had reportedly stormed out halfway through the meal, claiming she couldn't eat this trash. My mom and dad stayed behind, trying to salvage what was left of the evening, but the damage had already been done. Their sightseeing plans weren't much better. One day, they visited a famous museum, only to find that half the exhibits were closed for renovations. Another day, they spent hours navigating public transportation, only to miss their scheduled group tour entirely. Through it all, Emily's attitude remained predictably unbearable. She complained constantly, refused to participate in certain activities, and made it clear that she blamed my parents for the entire ordeal. "You said this was going to be amazing," she reportedly shouted during one heated argument. "This is the worst trip ever." My parents, who had started the week with a sense of optimism, were now visibly worn down. My mom's cheerful demeanor had given way to strained smiles and nervous attempts to keep the peace. My dad, usually so reserved and stoic, had grown noticeably irritable, snapping at both Emily and my mom when things went wrong. Meanwhile, I was having the time of my life. After realizing that my staycation could be exactly what I needed, I threw myself into enjoying it to the fullest. I booked a spa day at a local luxury hotel, indulging in massages, facials, and a long soak in a private hot tub. I treated myself to gourmet meals at some of the city's best restaurants, savoring every bite without a hint of guilt. I even took a day trip to a nearby vineyard, where I spent the afternoon sipping wine and wandering through sun-drenched fields. It was peaceful and rejuvenating, a stark contrast to the chaos my family was enduring overseas. Each time I received an update from the travel agency, I felt a renewed sense of satisfaction. My parents and Emily had tried to take advantage of me, assuming I would simply roll over and accept their decision without question. Now, they were learning the hard way that actions have consequences. By the end of the week, the travel agency sent me a final report summarizing their trip. The tone was unmistakably bemused, as if the staff themselves couldn't believe how poorly everything had gone. Their final night in Europe had been particularly memorable, though not in the way they'd hoped. The original plan had been for them to enjoy a romantic dinner cruise along the Seine, complete with fine dining and breathtaking views of Paris by night. Instead, they spent the evening at a small, overcrowded bistro, where they were seated next to a loud group of tourists and served mediocre food. According to the agency, my parents didn't even bother trying to salvage the night. They ate in silence, avoided eye contact with Emily, and left as soon as the meal was over. When I thought back to the moment I'd first handed them the original itinerary, I couldn't help but feel a pang of bitterness. I had been so excited to give them the trip of a lifetime, to share in the joy of their long-awaited dream. But they had taken that gift and twisted it into something selfish and thoughtless. Still, as I lounged on my couch that evening with a glass of wine in hand, I felt a sense of peace. I had done everything I could to make the trip special. Their decision to prioritize Emily over me had been their choice, and their mistake. For the first time in years, I felt like I had reclaimed some of the power I'd always given away so freely. It wasn't about revenge or pettiness. It was about learning to value myself and my efforts. As for my parents and Emily, I hoped the experience had taught them something about gratitude. But even if it hadn't, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let their choices dictate my happiness anymore. They still had one last hurdle to face, the awkward ride home and the inevitable confrontation. I wasn't sure how that would play out, but I knew I'd be ready for it. The day my family was scheduled to return from their week-long European adventure, I made sure to arrive at the airport on time. Not because I was particularly eager to see them, but because I was curious. I wanted to witness firsthand the aftermath of the trip they had hijacked. As I waited in the arrivals area, watching other travelers reunite with their loved ones in joyous embraces, I couldn't help but wonder what kind of mood my parents and Emily would be in. Would they be apologetic? Angry? Too exhausted to argue? Finally, I spotted them emerging from the crowd. My dad was pushing the luggage cart with a grim expression, his shoulders slumped under the weight of what I could only assume was a week's worth of regret. My mom trailed behind him, looking disheveled and uncharacteristically subdued. And then there was Emily, scowling like a petulant teenager, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as she stomped along in their wake. They looked exactly how I'd imagined, defeated. I waved to them as they approached, keeping my expression neutral. "Welcome back," I said, my tone polite but devoid of enthusiasm. My mom managed a weak smile. "Thanks for picking us up," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Of course," I replied, as if there had ever been any doubt that I'd fulfill my role as the dutiful child. We loaded their luggage into the car in silence, the tension between them palpable. Emily climbed into the back seat without a word, slamming the door behind her. My mom and dad settled into the front seats, exchanging weary glances but saying nothing. The drive home was awkward, to say the least. The usual small talk about their trip, what they'd seen, what they'd enjoyed, the memories they'd made, was conspicuously absent. Instead, the silence was broken only by the occasional sound of Emily sighing dramatically from the back seat. About halfway through the drive, my mom finally spoke up. "It wasn't what we expected," she muttered, her words heavy with disappointment. I glanced at her briefly before returning my attention to the road. "Oh," I said, keeping my tone light. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, clearly unsure how to phrase her response. "The trip," she said finally. "It was different from what you described." I let her words hang in the air for a moment before replying. "Well," I said, my voice calm but firm, "I hope Emily got the rest she needed. That was the point of bringing her, wasn't it?" The silence that followed was deafening. My mom shifted uncomfortably in her seat, and my dad stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched. Emily, for once, didn't say a word. When we finally pulled into their driveway, the atmosphere was so tense it felt like a rubber band stretched to its breaking point. My dad got out of the car first, unloading the luggage with quick, jerky movements. My mom lingered for a moment, as if she wanted to say something, but couldn't quite bring herself to do it. "Thanks again for the ride," she said eventually, her voice tinged with something that sounded like guilt. "Anytime," I replied with a small smile, knowing full well that neither of us believed it. As they made their way into the house, I caught a glimpse of Emily stomping up the front steps, her suitcase bumping loudly against each one. She didn't even bother to say goodbye. Later that evening, I sat in my living room, reflecting on the strange and anticlimactic reunion. Part of me had expected more, a confrontation, an apology, maybe even a heated argument. But instead, there had been nothing but silence and unspoken tension. It was clear that the trip had been a disaster, though none of them seemed ready to admit it outright. My parents and Emily had gambled on a decision they thought would benefit everyone, only to find themselves stuck in a situation that was far from what they'd envisioned. As for me, I felt a strange sense of closure. Watching them navigate the consequences of their choices had been oddly cathartic. They had taken something I'd offered in good faith and twisted it into something selfish and short-sighted. And while I hadn't gone out of my way to ruin their trip, I also hadn't gone out of my way to fix it. The next few days passed quietly. I didn't hear from my parents or Emily, and I didn't reach out to them either. It wasn't until the weekend that my mom finally called me, her tone tentative and cautious. "We should talk," she said, her voice laced with hesitation. "About the trip?" "Sure," I replied evenly. "Whenever you're ready." I knew the conversation was coming, and I wasn't sure how it would go. But one thing was certain, I wouldn't let them make me feel guilty for something that had been their decision from the start. The trip might have been a disaster, but the lessons it had taught all of us were undeniable. The weeks that followed my family's ill-fated European trip were tense, to say the least. When my parents and Emily returned, there was no grand apology, no acknowledgement of what had happened. Instead, they seemed to collectively decide to sweep the entire ordeal under the rug, as if pretending it never happened would make the awkwardness disappear. My dad, ever the stoic, adopted his usual strategy of avoidance. He didn't bring up the trip, didn't comment on the disastrous state of their plans, and certainly didn't apologize for their decision to replace me with Emily. He went back to his routine of early morning walks and evenings spent watching the news, acting as though everything was perfectly normal. My mom, however, wasn't as composed. She was trying to act like nothing was wrong, but I could see the cracks in her facade. Every time we spoke, she'd start to broach the topic of the trip before abruptly changing the subject, as if she couldn't decide whether to confront the situation or let it go. And then there was Emily. She flat out refused to speak to me. Not a word, not a text, not even a passive-aggressive comment on social media. She had gone radio silent, which, frankly, I found hilarious. I imagined her sulking in her room, scrolling through her Instagram feed and fuming every time she saw someone else's perfectly curated vacation photos. The first few days after they returned, I kept my distance. It wasn't out of anger. I had made my point, and I wasn't about to drag it out any further, but because I wanted to see how they'd handle things without my involvement. Would they come to me with an apology? Would they admit their mistake? Of course they didn't. Instead, I heard through the grapevine, my mom's chatty neighbor, to be specific, that Emily had been complaining nonstop about the trip. She said it was a nightmare, the neighbor had said with a conspiratorial grin. I thought she was going to burst into tears when she got to the part about the hotels. The story was as satisfying as it was predictable. Emily had spent the entire trip blaming my parents for the lackluster experience, accusing them of lying to her about what she could expect. She even accused my dad of being cheap for not fixing the accommodations after realizing how bad they were. My dad, apparently, hadn't taken kindly to her tantrums. If you're so unhappy, maybe you should plan your own trips from now on, he'd snapped during one particularly heated argument. When my mom finally worked up the nerve to call me a week later, her tone was hesitant, as if she were bracing herself for my reaction. "Hi, sweetheart," she began, her voice overly cheerful. "How have you been?" "Good," I replied evenly, waiting for her to get to the point. We made small talk for a few minutes. How work was going, how the weather had been, whether I'd seen the latest episode of a show we both liked. But eventually, the conversation shifted. "So, about the trip," she said, her tone faltering. I stayed silent, letting her fill the space. "I just wanted to say, well, we didn't mean for things to go the way they did," she continued. "It wasn't what we expected, and I know you must have been hurt when we decided to take Emily instead." I took a deep breath, steadying my voice before replying. "You're right. It was hurtful, especially since I put so much time and effort into planning it for you." "I know," she said quickly, her voice tinged with guilt. "I realize now that we didn't think it through. We just wanted to help Emily, but, well, it didn't work out the way we thought it would." There it was. Not quite an apology, but the closest I was going to get. "Mom," I said, cutting her off gently, "I don't need an explanation. What's done is done. But maybe next time, you'll think twice about who you prioritize." She was quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer, almost apologetic. "You're right," she said simply. The conversation ended soon after that, and while it didn't feel entirely satisfying, it felt like a step in the right direction. At the very least, she seemed to understand that their actions had consequences, and that I wasn't going to let them brush those consequences aside. In the following weeks, I continued to keep my distance, focusing on my own life and enjoying the peace that came with it. My parents made occasional efforts to reach out, but Emily remained silent, her stubbornness and entitlement keeping her locked in her own little bubble of resentment. I wasn't particularly bothered by the distance between us. For the first time in years, I felt like I had set a boundary and held firm. They had taken me for granted, assumed I would always put their needs above my own, and this trip had forced them to reevaluate that assumption. One evening, as I sat on my balcony with a cup of tea, I thought about how different things might have been if they'd made a different choice. If they had accepted my original plans and allowed me to join them, the trip could have been everything I'd envisioned, a chance to bond, to create lasting memories, to celebrate the family we were supposed to be. But instead, they had chosen to prioritize someone who didn't value the effort I'd put in. And while that choice had cost them dearly, it had also taught me an invaluable lesson. I didn't need to bend over backward to prove my worth to people who couldn't see it. The fallout from the trip might have been awkward, but in the end, it had brought me clarity. And that, I realized, was worth far more than any vacation. Months have passed since the fiasco that was my family's European trip, and while the dust is mostly settled, the experience has undeniably left its mark on all of us. The dynamic between me, my parents, and Emily has shifted in ways that I never could have anticipated. My parents, for one, are more cautious in how they approach me. It's not an obvious change. They still occasionally fall into their old habits of assuming I'll always be the responsible one, the problem solver, the one who sacrifices for the greater good. But now, there's a hesitation in their voices when they ask me for favors, a subtle but noticeable effort to tread carefully, as if they're testing the waters before diving in. It's a strange feeling, honestly. On one hand, I appreciate the newfound respect they seem to have for my time and boundaries. On the other hand, it's bittersweet knowing it took such an extreme situation to make them see me in a different light. Emily, however, has been the biggest surprise of all. In the weeks following their return, she remained stubbornly silent, refusing to acknowledge me in any capacity. At first, I chalked it up to her usual entitled behavior. She was angry that I hadn't swooped in to save the trip or magically fixed everything to her liking. But as time went on, I started to notice small changes. She stopped borrowing money from my parents, something she'd done shamelessly for years. She began spending less time lounging around the house and more time out and about, running errands or meeting with friends. And then, one day, my mom casually mentioned over dinner that Emily had started applying for jobs. "Wait, what?" I asked, caught completely off guard. My mom nodded, her expression a mix of pride and relief. "She's been looking for a few weeks now. She even went to a career workshop last weekend." I couldn't hide my surprise. Emily had spent most of her adult life avoiding responsibility like the plague. The idea of her actively seeking employment and attending a workshop, no less, was almost laughable. "Wow," I said, unable to keep the sarcasm out of my voice. "Guess the trip really opened her eyes, huh?" My mom didn't respond immediately. She just gave me a look, one that was equal parts sheepish and contemplative. "I think it made her realize a lot of things," she admitted softly. As for me, I've taken this entire experience as an opportunity to reassess my own priorities. The trip may have been a disaster, but it taught me something invaluable: the importance of setting boundaries and standing up for myself. For years, I had allowed myself to be the responsible one, the one who always put everyone else's needs before my own. I thought that was what it meant to be a good daughter, a good sibling, a good person. But this situation forced me to confront the reality that my kindness and generosity were being taken for granted, and that I deserved better. Since then, I've made a conscious effort to prioritize my own well-being. I've started saying no to things that don't align with my values or interests, even if it means disappointing others. I've learned to speak up when I feel overlooked or unappreciated, rather than bottling up my frustration. And, perhaps most importantly, I've stopped trying to please everyone at my own expense. Looking back, I don't regret how I handled the trip. Some might argue that I was petty or vindictive, but I see it differently. I gave my family exactly what they asked for, a trip tailored to the guest list they chose. If they were unhappy with the outcome, that wasn't my fault. Do I think the experience taught them a lesson? Maybe. My parents seem to have a newfound appreciation for the effort I put into things, and Emily's slow but steady journey toward independence suggests that she, too, has learned something from the ordeal. But whether or not they've truly changed isn't my concern anymore. For the first time in years, I feel free from the burden of trying to manage everyone else's happiness. One evening, my mom called me out of the blue. Her voice was warm, and there was a note of vulnerability that I hadn't heard before. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said. "For what?" I asked, genuinely puzzled. "For everything," she replied. "For the trip, for always being there for us, for being patient with us, even when we didn't deserve it." Her words caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. Finally, I said, "Thanks, Mom. That means a lot." We didn't talk about the trip again after that, but her words lingered with me. They weren't a full apology, but they were enough. Now, months later, things are different. My parents still have their moments of overstepping boundaries, but they're far more mindful than they used to be. Emily is slowly but surely finding her footing, and while we're not exactly close, there's a tentative truce between us. As for me, I've never been happier. My staycation during their trip turned out to be the catalyst for a new chapter in my life, one where I prioritize myself and refuse to let others take advantage of my generosity. In the end, The trip wasn't the disaster it seemed. It was a turning point, a necessary upheaval that forced all of us to reevaluate our roles within the family. And honestly, I wouldn't change a thing.